It's the holiday season. Let's talk about the most prolific mass murderer in Arkansas history. If you don't know who I'm talking about, I am talking about Ronald Gene Simmons. In 1987, in Pope County, Arkansas, Ronald Gene Simmons murdered 16 people over the course of a week. Ronald Gene Simmons actually lived further out west, like in the New Mexico area, for a good portion of his life. In 1979, he retired from the military after 22 years of service. During that time, he served in Vietnam and was actually a decorated Vietnam War veteran. During their life in New Mexico, Ronald and his wife, Becky, had 7 children. Those children in birth order were Ronald Jr., Sheila, William, Loretta, Eddie, Mary Ann, and Rebecca. Now, according to the podcast, The Devil of Pope County, which I highly recommend listening to, at the age of 17, the oldest daughter of the Simmons family actually gave birth to a child that she named Sylvia. Now, according to the podcast, one of the sons found out that the father of Sylvia was actually Ronald Gene Simmons himself. So Sheila had been raped by her own father, and that produced this child, Sylvia. Now, according to that podcast, other people around the Simmons family found the relationship between Ronald Gene Simmons and his daughter Sheila to be off-putting at the very least. And there were reports made to the authorities, including a report made by one of Sheila's own brothers to DHS, that the child that Sheila had given birth to was actually a child that belonged to Ronald Gene Simmons. But unfortunately, DHS didn't really do a whole lot about these claims. Now, eventually, the police were going to get involved. They had interviewed Sheila and they were going to arrest Ronald Gene Simmons. Well, Ronald Gene Simmons must have had a feeling that he was going to be arrested, because in the middle of the night, he picked his entire family up and fled New Mexico to the state of Arkansas. So they fled New Mexico in 1981. It wasn't until 2 years later, around 1983, that Ronald Gene Simmons actually settled his family in Dover, Arkansas, or outside of Dover, Arkansas, but in Pope County just the same. So he had purchased a 13-acre tract of land, and he essentially put 2 mobile homes together on this land, and that's where his family lived. Something that not enough people realize is that the Ronald Gene Simmons family actually did without a lot. They didn't have indoor plumbing. They didn't have, any kind of air conditioning. His family didn't have indoor plumbing, and his family didn't have air conditioning in the home. But Ronald Gene Simmons felt like he was more important than everybody else, because he actually did have air conditioning in his bedroom. The children weren't allowed to go in his bedroom, and that air conditioning wasn't shared with the rest of the family, but he was scrapping his family out pretty good. These people actually used a literal outhouse to use the bathroom, and Ronald Gene Simmons was sitting up in his room just fine. So because they used an outhouse, the children really didn't think anything about it whenever their father in 1987 started having them dig 3 separate pits on the family's land. When Ronald Gene Simmons left New Mexico, he left his job with the military, which I'm assuming paid decently. He left that job and he moved to Arkansas, where he worked what I would call lower level jobs. He spent a few years working for an oil company, but he was let go from that job because of inappropriate sexual advances. And then he spent some time working at the Sinclair Mini Mart in Russellville. Ronald Gene Simmons quit his job working for Sinclair Mini Mart on December 18th, 1987. On December 22nd, 1987, Ronald Jr. was actually visiting the home of his parents with his daughter, Barbara. Now, his daughter was 2 or 3 years old at the time. So on December 22nd, 1987, Ronald Gene Simmons Sr. beat his wife, Becky Simmons, the mother to his 7 children, with a blunt object and then shot her to death. On that same day, he also shot his son, Ronald Jr., and he strangled Ronald's daughter, Barbara, to death. Those 3 bodies were moved into one of the pits that Ronald Gene Simmons had instructed his children to dig. When Ronald Gene Simmons put these bodies in the pit, he actually put them in there with barbed wire in order to try to keep animals away from the remains. December 22nd, that same day, was actually the last day of school for his school-aged children. So Ronald Gene Simmons actually waited for his children to get off the bus that day. It is believed that Ronald kept the 4 children waiting outside and brought them in the house one at a time, starting with the oldest school-age child, Loretta. After Loretta, Eddie, Mary Ann, and Rebecca followed. Ronald Gene Simmons strangled his children one by one and then dunked them in a rain barrel to make sure that they were no longer alive. So after he had murdered those 4 children, he loaded them in a wheelbarrow and he put them in the same pit that their mother, brother, and niece were put in before. He then put dirt and barbed wire over the top as well as sheet metal. So far, that was 7 family members murdered by Ronald Gene Simmons. Sheila and her family and William and his family were both set to arrive at their parents' home on Mockingbird Hill the day after Christmas, so December 26th, 1987. So between the evening of December 22nd and December 26th, Ronald Gene Simmons just chilled. He just sat back, watched TV, and drank some beer, waiting to murder the rest of his family. On December 26th, Billy, his wife Renata, and their son Trey arrived first. So Ronald Gene Simmons shot Billy and Renata. He then took fishing line like he had everyone else and wrapped it around little Trey's throat and strangled him to death. Ronald Gene Simmons dragged Renata and Billy's bodies to the kitchen and covered them with jackets. He then put Trey's body in the trunk of a car. Then Sheila arrived with her husband Dennis and their children Sylvia and Michael. Now you have to remember, Ronald Gene Simmons was in love with Sheila and Sylvia was his daughter. Ronald Gene Simmons shot Sheila and Dennis. He then wrapped that fishing line around Sylvia's neck and around Michael's neck. He put Michael in the trunk of a car, but Sylvia, he actually put under a blanket on a bed in the bedroom. All of Ronald Gene Simmons' family members had now been murdered by him, but he wasn't done yet. After finishing off his family, Ronald Gene Simmons actually went to Russellville to run some errands. He went to a bar, had a few drinks, and then he went back home and spent the weekend at home with the bodies of his family members. On December 28th, Ronald Gene Simmons actually drove back to Russellville and he went to a law firm where he shot the receptionist, Kathy Kendrick. Kathy Kendrick was actually the woman that he had made inappropriate advances to that ended with him getting fired from his job at the oil company. He then went to the oil company where he shot J.D. Chaffin, and he also shot the owner of Sinclair Mini Mart, Rusty Taylor. He next went to the Mini Mart where he shot 2 people, Roberta Woolry and David Sawyer. After that, Ronald Gene Simmons went to Woodline Motor Freight and shot one last person. He shot his former supervisor, Joyce Butts. After he was done with his murder spree, he actually just sat down and waited for police to arrive. And at this point, police were running all over Russellville trying to figure out what the heck was going on with all of these shootings that were suddenly happening. It wasn't until after they got Ronald Gene Simmons in custody that they decided to take a trip to Mockingbird Hill, where they made the gruesome discovery slowly but surely and found all of the bodies. I think if Ronald Gene Simmons could have pled guilty to all of the murder charges and got the death penalty, he would have done that because Ronald Gene Simmons actually wanted to be put to death. And with the death penalty, there's so much said, like some people say it's justice, some people say it's the easy way out and life in prison would be justice. But in this case, Ronald Gene Simmons actually wanted the death penalty, and so many people felt like that was his just deserving. So Ronald Gene Simmons had 2 trials for the 16 murders. He was found guilty of all of the murders, and he was sentenced to the death penalty. At that time, in the state of Arkansas, there were no mandatory appeals for the death penalty, but other people filed appeals on Ronald's behalf. Ronald himself didn't file any appeals because he wanted to be put to death. On June 25th, 1990, Ronald Gene Simmons actually got his wish. He was put to death by lethal injection. I believe that Ronald Gene Simmons was Arkansas's first lethal injection, and he had a choice. That's what he chose. That wasn't Pope County's only family massacre, though. When we think about Arkansas cases where parents have slaughtered their children around the holiday season, we often think about Ronald Gene Simmons. That's a case that people all over Arkansas know, and it's a case that happened in Pope County. But did you know that more recently there was another family annihilator in Pope County? I remember it so clearly. It was on December 25th, 2020. I remember seeing the news that there had been several bodies found at a home in Pope County near Atkins. And I remember thinking, I wonder what happened to this family. I wonder who went into this home and killed these innocent little kids. But the reality of what happened was much worse than anything that I could have imagined as I watched the TV or anything that anyone else could have imagined, especially the families that were actually affected by this massacre. On December 25th, 2020, the adult son of Patricia Patrick showed up at her home at 5173 Pine Ridge Road, that, like I said, was near Atkins, for Christmas. They were going to have their family Christmas celebration that day, but there wasn't an answer at the door. So the son was able to make his way into the home. Inside the home, he made a shocking discovery. He found 5 bodies inside under the Christmas tree. Found that day were the bodies of 7-year-old Danielle, 10-year-old Lavina, 12-year-old Abigail, and 61-year-old Patricia Patrick, as well as 31-year-old Jaquita Chase. The father of one of the children, Dustin Countryman, who was the father of 10-year-old Lavina, has done interviews. One that I found was to A Woman's Own, and he told about his relationship with Lavina and information that he had surrounding that time period. When Dustin Countryman first met Jaquita Chase, she was a mother to 1-year-old Abigail Heflin. And according to Dustin, Jaquita was a good mother to Abigail, and soon after, during the time of their relationship, they had their daughter, Lavina, but at some point, Jaquita turned to drugs, and Dustin gave her a choice. It's either drugs or your family, and Jaquita could not make that choice. So Jaquita took her daughter, Abigail, and she left. Now, Dustin did say in his interview that he wished he could have kept Abigail, but he couldn't. That wasn't his child. So Dustin was the primary caregiver to Lavina until Jaquita eventually got sober. And when Jaquita did get sober, he allowed Jaquita to begin having a relationship with her daughter. That happened after Lavina turned 2 years old. Jaquita called and said she had gone to rehab. Dustin visited her and she appeared to be sober. So he allowed the relationship to start building slowly. It wasn't like he initially just sent Lavina to stay with Jaquita. It just worked up slowly where Lavina was spending more time with Jaquita. Now, according to Dustin, in this interview that he gave, he says that Jaquita eventually decided that she was going to move away, and she really didn't give Dustin a choice. She just decided that she was going to take Lavina with her. But unfortunately, Jaquita didn't stay sober. In 2017, Jaquita was arrested with her then husband, Benjamin, for shoplifting at Walmart, where they attempted to steal over $1,000 worth of product. But the bigger thing, I think, is that whenever Jaquita was arrested and taken to the police station, at the police department, they found a bottle of pills in her bra that she admitted to having. And in that pill bottle, which was in her bra but marked Benjamin Chase, which was her husband's name at the time, there were several pills each of oxycodone and hydrocodone. And then in August of 2018, Jaquita was arrested again. This time she was arrested after a woman in Dover, Arkansas called police because she saw a woman pull up into her driveway and attempt to get inside of her vehicle. And then when she tried to stop the woman took off in the vehicle that she arrived in. Police tried to stop the woman. They were eventually able to after the vehicle that she was driving was kind of wrecked. Now, the vehicle that Jaquita was driving that day was reported stolen the day before, but Jaquita actually told police that her name was the name of the owner of the vehicle. So whenever she was being booked into jail, she actually gave a fake name, and she was charged with 2 counts of criminal mischief, a count of theft by receiving, and 1 count of forgery. So it is clear that Jaquita's life was just spinning out of control at this time. And Dustin did what I think any parent might do. He took Jaquita to court and he was able to get custody of his daughter, Lavina. Now, what he didn't realize, or maybe he did realize it, I don't know. I didn't find anything in court documents saying that he already knew, but Jaquita's own mother, Patricia Patrick, had taken Jaquita to court earlier in the year, like a month before, to get custody or guardianship of the 3 minor girls. And all this was happening as a way to protect the girls because Jaquita was on drugs and she was making poor decisions. Her life was spinning out of control. She was having what some identified as mental health issues, but it was clear that the girls weren't really safe with her. So first, Patricia went and got custody of the 3 girls, and in that custody order, it said that Jaquita was not permitted to be alone with the children, only if Patricia was there. And then Dustin went and got custody of his daughter. Now, they did eventually agree on an order where it looks to me like Dustin and Patricia essentially split custody of Lavina 1 week on and 1 week off. And Jaquita was permitted to see Lavina only when Patricia had Lavina and only when Patricia was there. She couldn't even take Lavina out of Patricia's line of sight or hearing. Now, I don't know if Jaquita ever actually cleaned up her life, but according to the interview that Dustin gave in October of 2020, he actually went over to what I'm assuming is Patricia's home, and he visited with Lavina there. Lavina was showing him her room and her toys that she had, but he said that Lavina was behaving withdrawn. And after Lavina's death, he does believe that Lavina was withdrawn because she knew that her mom was back on drugs and she didn't want for Dustin to know. At any rate, Dustin says that on December 24th, Christmas Eve of 2020, he tried to call Jaquita or Patricia and talk about their plans for the next day, but he was unable to get anyone to answer the phone. And then he called again on December 25th. Now, they still didn't answer on the 25th, and he assumed that there was no answer because they were busy celebrating the holiday. He and his now wife then drove over to Patricia's home, and they weren't able to get any answer at the door. He said that it was just completely silent. He assumed that no one was home. It wasn't until the evening of December 25th, after the bodies were found, that he actually got a call from a cousin of Jaquita saying that they had all been murdered. Now, I do think that initially when this crime happened, police didn't really reveal a lot of details. It wasn't until later on they did start revealing details, and the evidence tells a story. The story that the evidence tells in this case was that on Christmas 2020, Jaquita shot each and every one of her little girls as well as her mother. She then took a hammer and she beat their bodies. It was a massive case of overkill. And you might wonder, why do I live in Arkansas but I haven't heard of this case? Well, the reason you probably haven't heard of it is because after Jaquita shot her children and shot her mother, and after she took a hammer and she beat their bodies, she shot herself. So there was never any person that was held responsible for taking these 4 innocent lives. And I can't speak for the fathers of Abigail or Danielle, but I was able to briefly message Dustin, and it is clear that Dustin has a very hard time dealing with this holiday and probably will for the rest of his life because his precious daughter was stolen away from him by an evil mother who, according to police, was in a drug psychosis state whenever she committed this heinous crime. As you spend this holiday season with your loved ones, please keep in mind families like this that have been forever affected by tragedy and will not get to spend this holiday season with their loved ones. Jaquita Chase was actually buried beside her young daughters, and so when people visit the cemetery, eventually memories will fade and she'll be remembered as a mother and not the vile murderer that she became before she quickly took her life to avoid any responsibility for her actions and forever robbed so many families, not just of their loved ones, but forever robbed them of justice.